Star Wars is good science fantasy. Dune is great science fiction.
A beginning is a very delicate time.
That's not to say that Star Wars isn't compelling or entertaining or that the characters aren't great. It's more that they approach the genre from different angles. Star Wars' core goal throughout all of its films, spin-off series, games, and books is to be a fun adventure. There's meaning, yes, but it's an element, not the core part being delivered. Dune's main purpose, on the other hand, is to address great issues, such as colonization, humanity's relationship with religious fervor, and the position of human society in the vastness of eternity. Good and great, in this sense, isn't a metric of quality, it's a distinction of separately achieved ambition. Star Wars aims for entertainment. Dune aims to relay universal truths. That's not to say Star Wars is vapid or devoid of meaning, far from it. George Lucas has been very upfront about his intentions.
The good guys are the rebels. They're using asymmetric warfare against a highly organized empire. I think we call those guys terrorists.
When I did it, they were Viet Cong.
However, at the end of the day, the Star Wars saga, it exists for you to have fun. But Dune isn't about that. But that's also not to say it doesn't have spectacle or amazing moments. It surely does. But there's a difference between seeing a Death Star, this colossal force of power that can obliterate planets, and encountering one of the sandworms. The worm is far, far smaller than the Death Star, and yet Dune makes it feel even more colossal. Part of that is because we see the Death Star in its entirety. We see all of it. We understand it fairly quickly. But when we see a sandworm, the majority of its body is buried under the surface. Star Wars shows you everything it can to thrill. Dune deliberately restrains itself to evoke awe. In doing so, paradoxically, Dune tells a far larger story than Star Wars ever could by showing far less. At this point in the video, I'd like to remind you to like and subscribe if you want to see more.
Get on with it! Yes, get on with it!
Now, I should probably admit my biases at the door. I've always liked Star Wars, but Dune is something I always saw as this intimidating, massive thing.
On Sci-Fi Cinematic Saturdays.
He who controls the spice controls the universe.
Now, growing up, my extended family would speak of it like some might reference the Odyssey, with a level of weight and reverence. I remember watching the David Lynch film on the Sci-Fi channel years ago. I think it was the extended cut, but I can't be certain in memory.
Dune, a special 4-hour presentation. Saturday at 7 p.m. Eastern.
And even with its flaws, I could tell I was looking at something alien. When it came time to read the books, that alien quality became all the greater, so much so that, upon revisiting the works time and time again, I discovered new angles through which to discuss Dune. With Star Wars, there are simply fewer levels to explore. Dune's world building incorporates political factions, colonization, industrial business complexes, esoteric religions, eugenics, anti-technological warfare, and the exploration of history, not in decades, as with Star Wars, but in millennia. So boiling down Dune to what I'm hoping is a shorter video is going to be rough, but I will oversimplify concepts in this video. I will. But I hope that my point will be made clear how Star Wars, for all the qualities I love about it, is simply no Dune.
Epic masterpiece.
The sleeper has awakened!
From visionary director David Lynch. Dune. Tonight at 7. Only on Sci-Fi.
A beginning is a very delicate time. So before we get into the topic, let's discuss what the story of both sagas are, to establish some baseline information.
What's in there?
Only what you take with you.
Star Wars saga is, well, you know this already. Anakin Skywalker is the chosen one, destined to bring balance to the Force. During a destructive civil war, Anakin becomes a hero, but is not given the recognition among his peers that he feels he is owed. When he has visions of his future with his secret lover, Padme, where he sees that Padme is doomed to die, Anakin succumbs to the influence of the evil Palpatine, becoming Darth Vader and enacting a genocide against the Jedi, followed by a new universal order. Fast forward a few years later, and Luke Skywalker, Anakin's secret child with Padme, is trained under Anakin's old master Obi-Wan to defeat Vader and overthrow the Empire. After several adventures where he meets several new friends, he manages to beat Vader and the Empire. Things seem to be going great until decades later, a new iteration of the Empire, the First Order, emerges and exploits the weak government put in place after the rebellion gained control. Look, you know the story of Star Wars, you've seen it. Dune, however, is very different. Dune is about a boy named Paul, heir to House Atreides. House Atreides is locked in warfare with the vile House Harkonnen, a militaristic family who has apparently given up control of the spice melange. Melange is essential to just about everything in the Dune universe. This geriatric drug allows the space navigators to fold space, Dune's equivalent of hyperspace travel, where you can travel from one end of the universe to the next without moving. Without spice, no one would be able to travel anywhere in the galaxy. It also gives people special, unique abilities, such as the ability to see into the future and to expand consciousness. But unlike, say, the Force, the spice has a few major trade-offs. For one, it's highly addictive. If you consume melange, you cannot go without it for long, otherwise you will die. High exposure to the melange turns your eyes a full shade of blue. Blue within blue, they describe it. Even higher, and you might mutate into a grotesque entity, like the Chom navigators who can fold space.
I forgot to tell you. The spice exists on only one planet in the entire universe. The planet is Arrakis, also known as Dune.
So House Harkonnen surrenders control over Arrakis to House Atreides, which the head of House Atreides, Duke Leto, correctly recognizes as a trap. But he proceeds to accept Arrakis anyway, hoping to subvert House Harkonnen's scheme by recognizing it's a trap. This does not work. Paul and his mother, Leto's concubine, the Lady Jessica, wander the desert after House Atreides is destroyed. There they meet the Fremen, the native people of Arrakis, who have been ostracized in their world by the Padishah Emperor. From there, Paul becomes Muad'Dib, the messianic leader of the Fremen, as well as the Kwisatz Haderach, a male member of the Bene Gesserit. We'll get to them later. He overthrows House Harkonnen, learns the secret of spice production, and uses power over spice to leverage the Padishah Emperor, the Bene Gesserit, and the Spacing Guild to his will. And that covers basically the first book, roughly.
Where treachery is the spice of life.
They shall come all for violence.
When describing Dune, it is undeniably science fiction, with an element of fantasy to it, with the expanded consciousness and future vision and what have you. Star Wars, on the other hand, is fantasy pretending to be sci-fi. There is precious little science in Star Wars, at least in its mainline films. The expanded canon tries to explain how lightsabers function or how all the machinery operates, but the reality is this is just window dressing. It doesn't really affect the core storyline all that much. Hyperspace could be magic. It wouldn't really matter how hyperspace works.
Intergalactic travel within a star whale. Now I really have done it all.
Dune, by contrast, is meticulously developed. In a lot of ways, it's more like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Ironic considering Tolkien was not a fan of Frank Herbert's work. And the Tolkien comparisons only become deeper when we consider the legacy of both Herbert and Tolkien's work, but we'll get to that in a bit.
Science fiction, you got two branches. One is science, and the other is social. It isn't the science, aliens, and all that kind of stuff that I get focused on.
There are layers to Dune's world building. First, there's the Empire, a political structure that feeds into the noble houses. The battle between House Harkonnen and House Atreides is ultimately one of political influence and power, a blood feud that's led to a war that ultimately feels quite trivial in the scheme of things. It started 10,000 years before the first book, to the point where the original origins of the feud barely matter. But it leads to a cycle of violence. The Baron Harkonnen kills Paul's father, so Paul sets out to kill him. Though ironically, and this is a spoiler for the first book, mind you, ironically, we later learn that Paul's mother, the Lady Jessica, is the Baron Harkonnen's bastard daughter. This means that Paul's father was murdered by Paul's grandfather. Now, this also leads to the second component of Dune's world building, the Bene Gesserit. These witches have manipulated society throughout history through political influence and selective breeding. This is in order to maintain a continuity throughout history. Eugenics have been employed through secret unions and marriages, all to create a messiah, the Kwisatz Haderach, a male witch. On the surface, they resemble Star Wars' Jedi, with both being an esoteric organization that maintain order throughout the galaxy and possess strange abilities. But the difference here is that while the Jedi maintain control with Force, the Bene Gesserit maintain control with political manipulation, the mind-altering voice, and again, eugenics. Then there's industry, upon which the earlier two branches feed. Spice isn't just a power source, it's a resource. It's like oil, and Arrakis is much like Iraq was during Frank Herbert's lifetime. Well, during our lifetimes too. They even sound similar, and certainly both sport significant deserts, and both are subject to horrible colonization. The Spacing Guild buys spice in mass, but without the Spacing Guild, no one would be able to travel from planet to planet. As such, these three separate layers of society hold everything together: political manipulation, science and mathematics, raw power. Compare that to Star Wars. We have the Republic/Empire and the Jedi, two layers of influence. In the prequels, though, these two layers essentially function as an interchangeable entity. It's hard to distinguish where the Jedi Order ends and the Senators begin, because they have such an influence on each other. By the time the Empire takes over, the Jedi Order is obliterated, leaving scattered survivors in its wake. Come the era of the New Republic and the First Order, the Jedi Order struggles to rebuild itself, but again is just an esoteric, separate religion, with minimal actual influence on the plot, beyond a couple of Jedi who partake in government activity. But all things in Star Wars are secondary to the Force, which exists beyond any one individual. The concept of balance of the Force is emphasized a lot in Star Wars, but it's rarely really expanded upon. Is balance just peace? Then, well, why is there a light and a dark side? How can you have balance if the light side has to beat the dark? Is balance in the Force referring to when there's an equal amount of light and dark in the universe? Then why does defeating the Sith lead to it being balanced? Because there's no dark side users after the Sith are defeated until we get to Kylo Ren and all that in the sequels. These ambiguous questions don't have satisfying answers because balancing the Force is an abstract goal. It's not tangible. How it's defined changes from film to film. In the original trilogy, it's beating the Sith. But in the sequel trilogy, we see that balancing the Force results in the dyad between Rey and Kylo Ren. So did balancing the Force change from sequel trilogy to the original trilogy? Or did the original trilogy characters not understand what balancing the Force really meant? The problem with this is that it's so ambiguous and so open to interpretation that any number of writers can come in and reinterpret what balancing the Force means. But Dune is very grounded. There is no ambiguity. If you control the spice, you control the universe. You control the spice by managing spice production, or threatening to destroy it. It's that simple.
He who controls the spice controls the universe.
Paul manages to win in the first book because he figures out how he can exploit every system's weakness. It's by threatening to destroy the spice. In doing so, he uses the threat of its destruction to gain political influence. But no one can destroy the Force.
The Jedi are romanticized, deified. But if you strip away the myth and look at their deeds, the legacy of the Jedi is failure.
Star Wars and Dune are both stories about chosen ones who bring about ruination to their world through destructive, genocidal wars, and whose children carry on their legacy by becoming mythic figures themselves. That's an oversimplification of the story, but it's a core tenet to focus on. The temptation a casual viewer might have when watching Dune or Star Wars is to compare Luke Skywalker, the central protagonist of the original trilogy, to Paul Atreides, because at first both seem to follow the typical hero's journey, especially when comparing the original trilogy to the first Dune book. In both, our heroes are heirs to greatness who haven't realized their skills. Sure, Paul is born knowing he is the heir to House Atreides, while Luke's heritage as son of Anakin Skywalker has to be revealed to him. We see both pursue the adversary that destroyed their father.
From a certain point of view.
They become aware of a greater destiny bestowed upon them, and eventually they bring order to the galaxy by overthrowing an empire. If Dune ended with the first book, that comparison would be fine. Sure, Paul feels dread that his name, Muad'Dib, has become a killing word. But Luke has darker moments of contemplation too. The Force battle in the cave in The Empire Strikes Back, the dark robes he wears in Return of the Jedi, the moment where he loses control and almost slays his father at the end of Return of the Jedi, that's a darkness, but Luke overcomes it. Paul, well, he dreads that his destiny is darker. He has a dark destiny ahead of him, but we don't really see that in the first book. But then you read Dune Messiah and realize you had it backwards. Luke is a hero. He's a savior. But Paul, while presented at first as a Christ-like Messiah, Dune Messiah reveals that no, Paul is not Christ. In defeating House Harkonnen and the Padishah Emperor, Paul sends the various systems of the galaxy into a tailspin. He has dismantled the very systems used to maintain order, and a new order, a new jihad, is spreading from planet to planet. And in the process, untold billions of people are dying. Entire planets are wiped out. And it's a casual occurrence for him. Here was the race consciousness that he had known once as his own terrible purpose. Here was the reason enough for Kwisatz Haderach, or Lassam al-Ghaib, or even the halting schemes of the Bene Gesserit. The race of humans had felt its own dormancy, sensed itself grown stale, and knew not only the need to experience turmoil in which the genes would mingle and the strong new mixtures survive. All humans were alive as an unconscious single organism in this moment, experiencing a kind of sexual heat that could override any barrier. And Paul saw how futile were any efforts of his to change any smallest bit of this. He thought to oppose the jihad within himself, but the jihad would be. Paul Atreides is not Christ. Paul Atreides is the Antichrist. Paul isn't Luke, he's Anakin. If you want to understand Paul's rise and fall, look no further than Darth Vader, a boy who, from the time he was a child, was groomed to be the chosen one, only to lead a destructive civil war that culminates in him becoming the galaxy's greatest villain. In his pursuit for peace, he loses everything he once loved, only to watch his son fulfill a destiny far beyond that which he could ever dream. In this sense, Paul's story is a tragedy, like the kings of Shakespeare, who experience a great rise to power, only to catastrophically fall. It's completely understandable why everyone would want to destroy Paul. The same reason Paul wanted to conquer them. Power, influence, money.
There is no escape.
Of course, there are so many more things to discuss about Dune. The rich cast of characters, the love affair between Chani and Paul, the brilliance of Lady Jessica's character, Gurney Halleck, Yui, and of course the Baron Harkonnen himself. But to engage in that discussion will distract us from the core argument of this video essay. What makes Dune good at being great, and Star Wars great at being good? The ultimate distinction here is subtlety versus overt messaging. Star Wars has never been subtle about what it's trying to communicate. Sure, some people might watch and miss the overt references to Vietnam in the original trilogy, or the direct parallels between George Bush's War on Terror and the prequels.
So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause.
But no one can argue that Lucas or his successors tried to hide their messaging. Frank Herbert at times is very unsubtle. Again, Arrakis sounds just like Iraq. But at other times, he is very subtle.
Don't trust leaders to always be right. I worked to create a leader in this book who would be really an attractive, charismatic person for all the good reasons, not for any bad reasons. Then power comes to him. He makes decisions. Some of his decisions made for millions of people, millions upon millions of people, don't work out too well.
There are several messages woven throughout the series, right down to an event that occurs prior to the story's start, the Butlerian Jihad. In Dune, there are no AI and no computers. Rather, Mentats, individuals who have trained themselves to function as computers, have replaced these machines. And the reason for this is very simple. Humanity depended too much on computers to think for them, so humanity found a substitute. The Butlerian Jihad is a rebellion against machine learning and machine dependency that has ramifications for thousands of years in universe. This is a very subtle warning against the over-reliance on technology, true, which is ironic given that the Padishah Empire is entirely functionally dependent on melange. But Frank Herbert isn't just finding a way to avoid using androids and computers in his future. He's also including a message about the subtle cycles of history, where humanity's entire dependency on a singular form of technology requires extreme upheaval in order to reverse course on it. But he's also talking about humanity coming to conclusions on their own, not relying on others and other mechanisms to answer life's greatest questions. Humanity's independence from reliance. But Herbert doesn't really give any answers to these complex questions. Rather, much like humanity following the Butlerian Jihad, Herbert asks his readers to think for themselves and to not wait for an easy answer to his questions. In this sense, there are two Star Wars films that come closest to matching the style of Dune. One is Revenge of the Sith, for reasons we've already outlined, the rise and fall of a Masonic hero, but the other one, and a lot of Star Wars fans are not going to like this, the other one's The Last Jedi.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
The Last Jedi is an attempt in the Star Wars saga to be self-reflective, to review what has come before in order to assemble messaging that runs throughout the series. It's not simply let the past die, it's what has the past done and how can we grow beyond it. It's a means to break up stagnant storytelling rather than erase the past. The cycles of mentors and students, how the failures of past heroes have led to the disasters that follow them, the divide between legends and their deeds. I think one reason I enjoyed The Last Jedi as much as I did is because I'm a Dune fan first and a Star Wars fan second, and The Last Jedi does feel like it's taken a page out of Dune's book. Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi serves the same role that Paul plays in Children of Dune. Both have gone into exile following great personal failures that have brought about disaster and conflict both in their own lives and to the universe around them. However, while Luke aims to end the Jedi Order and goes into exile to die, Paul becomes the preacher, a wandering figure in the desert who gradually starts to rally a religious order around him. Also, Children of Dune has the somehow Palpatine's returned element in it as well, by having the Baron Harkonnen's essence possess Paul's sister Aaliyah. To explain the concept of being pre-born and the expended consciousness, that would take a lot of time, but essentially it's a way that Harkonnen can return to unleash one final act of vengeance upon House Atreides by destroying all the spice from within Dune. It's complicated, it's weird, that's Dune for you. Oh, and both stories end with these noteworthy characters dying, so the next generation of characters can help salvage their world to stop destruction, to stop forces of darkness. Of course, in Star Wars, this takes the form of Rey, who's a pretty divisive character, whereas in Children of Dune, it takes Leto II is God Emperor of Dune is trippy, guys. I don't know what to tell you. While Dune Messiah and later God Emperor of Dune are more overt deconstructions of Dune's legacy, The Last Jedi does serve a similar role in that it grounds and expands the legacy of the original trilogy by showing both the vast, indifferent scale of the universe cosmology and the human tragedy of heroes caught up in great difficulty. Ultimately, both The Last Jedi and Dune serve a similar purpose.
Don't trust leaders to always be right.
You have a great line, which is, so this is how liberty dies.
We're in the middle of it right now.
To thunderous applause.
But Star Wars and Dune do have something else in common that I think is very important to discuss. One person. Kevin J. Anderson.
The Winds of Dune by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson.
Kevin J. Anderson rose to fame, or maybe infamy, when writing the Star Wars Jedi Academy novels. At the time, fans did not like these novels. They didn't like them at all. And while some have grown nostalgic for these books, they're still at best seen as average entries in the Legends canon. Whenever Star Wars fans celebrate the old continuity over the Disney era, I always want to say that nothing Disney is currently doing is as disappointing as some of these old novels. Anderson would continue to write for Star Wars until 2005, working on various novels and comics. However, his work really ended in Star Wars because he was occupied bringing his writing talents to another universe. Dune. Frank Herbert died before he could finish his second Dune trilogy. Now, there are 6 books in the Dune series under Herbert. The initial trilogy of Dune, Dune Messiah, and Children of Dune. Then there's God Emperor of Dune, which is kind of a bridge between these 2 trilogies, and a second unfinished trilogy. Chapter House Dune ends on a cliffhanger, so fans for years wanted to know how the story ended, but Herbert had passed on. Enter Frank's son and new arbiter of his estate, Brian Herbert, who claimed he found his father's notes in a safety deposit box. From this, he wrote several spin-off novels, as well as completed the trilogy that his father aimed to write. He collaborated with Kevin J. Anderson to draft the last book in his father's final trilogy, only they decided to divide the book into 2 books, and then write several prequels, and books that take place between the other books. Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson have written 20 other Dune novels, with more coming. When Star Wars puts out an underwhelming piece of content, fans complain nonstop, but they watch it, they read it. But you can tell how profoundly disappointing the Dune books are, because Dune fans desperately try to forget they exist. This is the real divide between Dune and Star Wars. Kevin J. Anderson came to Star Wars, wrote a few subpar novels, and the world kept turning. But for Dune fans, the drop-off is severe.
What's in the box?
Pain.
With science fiction that intends to be good, anything subpar is forgivable. The question becomes, did this entertain me enough? Failings are easier to forgive. There might be a reason The Last Jedi upset so many people, because by seeking to raise some genuinely interesting questions, it forced people to look at the facade behind their escapist media.
The Jedi are romanticized, deified. But if you strip away the myth and look at their deeds, the legacy of the Jedi is failure.
However, when a great science fiction story produces something that aims to be good and falls short of that, being just bad, the level of disappointment hits all the harder, especially when the quantity of bad media becomes overwhelming. There are so many subpar Dune books that it suffocates the legacy of the original. It might be easier to compare Brian Herbert to Christopher Tolkien, and that both are arbiters of their father's literary estate, but the reverence Christopher Tolkien showed to Lord of the Rings is just incomparable to the way Brian Herbert exploited his father's legacy. It's not even comparable to what Disney did with Star Wars, because Disney actually lowered the output of media. There are far less books coming out than there were at the heyday of Lucasfilms and that whole thing. They put more money behind the content they produced, and in many cases did create some occasionally excellent pieces of media. The Last Jedi remains a divisive movie, but people are still talking about it years later. Andor is a genuinely brilliant piece of science fiction, some of the best sci-fi TV we've seen in a decade, and The Mandalorian became a sensation for a very good reason. But the only lasting legacy Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson have left on the Dune franchise is confusion, because newcomers might look at this huge body of work and not know where to start. Yes, there's the original book, but what's next? Arguably, even 6 books might be too much for some fans, but 26? Where do you even start with that without a guide? Dune is great science fiction, followed by a great series of books, and smothered by subpar trash. But Star Wars, the reason it is merely good and not great, is also the reason why it continues to be relevant, why it continues to entertain people decades later. When Star Wars is bad, sure, it's bad, but you're still going to watch the next thing when it comes out. You're still going to hold out for some glimmer of hope that what comes next will be good. Because that's attainable for Star Wars. But Dune, when it fails hard. It's genuinely hard to muster up any optimism about the future, because the books are just that bad. And this is why the new series of films is so miraculous. It's in many ways revitalized one of science fiction's greatest sagas in a way that, say, Apple TV's Foundation series hasn't. Old Sci-Fi is a treasure trove of fantastic stories that modern audiences might simply not know about. There are so many sagas that could be reinterpreted for modern audiences. Now, personally, I'm still holding out hope for a Peter Jackson adapted version of Arthur Conan Doyle's Lost World, but I won't hold my breath. Dune is having a revitalization, and I'm hoping that the greatness of this saga will outshine the dreck that has accumulated over its once pristine reputation. Also, just a final note, that David Lynch film, It's aesthetically fantastic.
The sleeper has awakened!